Okay, welcome into this episode of Mythic Existence. Today we are going to be talking about monsters in Lord of the Rings. We're going to dive into the deep lore of Tolkien's legendarium, which stretches back to the creation of Arda through the Song of the Ainur, straight through to the War of the Rings. We'll try and determine where these beings came from in myth and what function they serve, so sit back, relax, and enjoy another episode. So I've been reading Lord of the Rings a lot recently, as well as the Silmarillion, which is always a word I struggle with, so bear with me when I say it. But so far I've read The Fellowship. I'm almost done with the Two Towers. If you've never read them before, which this is my first read through of all three of them, I read The Fellowship when I was in elementary school. At least I think I got through it. But then, every book is kind of split into two books. It's book 1, book 2, book 3, and book 4. That's what comprises the Fellowship of the Rings and the Two Towers. I was kind of struck by in the Two Towers that Frodo doesn't appear until book 4. So in the first half of the Two Towers, Frodo and Sam are completely not there. So I feel like there's a real focus on Frodo in the movies and his importance, but to me, I really love, basically the story of Aragorn and Gandalf and all of those characters. So the Silmarillion, if you're not familiar, is basically like the creation myth of Lord of the Rings, or at least of Middle-earth itself. And so the Silmarillion really tells the story of the creation of the world and the creation of all of the races, and it's just a giant history. That one reads like a straight-up historical document, and it's very long, so I've been working my way through that. But I've been doing a lot of reading, just on internet pages and watching some YouTube videos of that sort of stuff as well. So anyway, I thought that a Lord of the Rings episode would be really, really interesting. And, I'm calling it Tolkien's Monsters, but as we've discussed in previous episode about monsters and monstrosity, defining monstrosity is difficult. It's all about, whose perspective and who is defining the monsters. As we've said, monsters are always defined by what's not monstrous. So maybe creatures would be a better word, because on this episode we're going to be talking about Barrow Whites, Orcs, ents, and the giant spiders. There are so many monsters and creatures in Tolkien's work that I can't cover all of them in one episode, and it was just kind of pick and choose which ones I felt like doing. So this is going to be part 1. Who knows how many parts this could be. The next episode, I would really like to cover stuff like balrogs and ringwraiths and nazguls. But for this episode, I felt like this would be a good starting point just because Barrow Whites are the first thing that really comes up in the Fellowship of the Rings, but it's not covered in the movie. So that's one of the major omissions. Let's get into the discussion of the Barrow Whites. Basically, they appear at the start of the Fellowship of the Ring. Maybe they actually appear after the ringwraiths. I can't quite remember what the order is, so maybe I'm wrong in saying that they're first. But basically, the Barrow Whites are located in what's called the Barrow Downs, and that is beyond the Brandywine River and beyond the Old Forest. And the Barrow Downs are basically a series of burial mounds for men of old, essentially. And what Barrow Whites are is they're basically shape-shifting phantoms with dark black robes, and they have voices that are horrible and hypnotic, and they have skeletal hands and bodies, And so if you've ever played Skyrim, these creatures are based off of draugrs. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Old Norse mythology, who are basically evil spirits that inhabit burial chambers. So in Skyrim, there's these things called draugrs, which they don't have the like Barrow Whites usually have like capes, I think, those dark black robes, basically. It's not how they are in Skyrim, but that's how they are in Tolkien. So yeah, they're based off of these, evil spirits that inhabit burial chambers from Norse mythology. And that's one thing that we're going to be talking about, is that Tolkien always has some kind of classical origin for a lot of his stuff, and it's what's really interesting about his work. If you don't know a lot about him, I mean, Tolkien was a scholar and an academic, and an expert on language and on mythology itself, especially Norse mythology and like British mythology, or folklore, essentially. So it's a perfect topic for this channel. Basically, what happens is that the hobbits are abducted by the Barrow Whites and are taken down into one of their tombs, and they're bound and are going to be sacrificed, but they're susceptible to strong incantations, and in particular, they are susceptible to Tom Bombadil's song. And so Tom Bombadil is a really strange guy in Lord of the Rings, and again, he's not in the Fellowship of the Rings, but he's a dude. He lives in the Old Forest, and Frodo and his companions, they encounter him, and he's not a bad person. He's not a good person. He comes off as being good, but he's kind of like above the good and evil kind of like war or tribulations in Middle Earth. And he calls himself the eldest. That's what he says. And he says he remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. So, I mean, a lot of people that are interested in Lord of the Rings, I think, don't really know a lot about the creation of the world. And Tolkien actually coined a term called mythopoeia for making his mythic world, essentially. And he has this whole insane backstory and creation myth. So the quick and short of that is that basically there was this being called Iluvatar that wanted to, sing a world or create a world into existence, and he created a bunch of beings that sung the world into existence. And Middle Earth takes place on a planet called Arda, and so basically he said that he remembers when rain and the forests were made. Tom Bombadil does. And he also says that he came before the Dark Lord Melkor. And so Melkor is one of the Valar, if I'm getting that correctly. There's Valar, Maiar, and Ainur, and I sometimes get them confused, but Melkor was one of the highest beings created by Iluvatar, but Melkor ended up turning evil. And Melkor is actually where all of the evil in Arda and Middle Earth comes from. So he's the ultimate evil. It's not Sauron. Melkor is the ultimate evil in Middle Earth. And it's also possible that Tom Bombadil had been there before the Valar and he's really ancient, basically, and it's unclear exactly what he is. A lot of people speculate on who he is. Some say that he's actually the song of the Ainur come to Middle Earth as a being, or that he might be Iluvatar himself. I don't know what to believe. He might just be this really old guy, but he's not like old and decrepit. He's pretty young and youthful, actually. So anyway, they're freed by the Song of Tom Bombadil. The history of the Barrow Whites is kind of interesting. They were sent by the Witch King of Angmar to keep the Dunedain of Cardolan from resettling the area after they had been wiped out by the plague. It's also possible, some people speculate, that the Witch King had visited the Barrow Downs searching for Frodo, and he was the one that roused the Barrow Whites to abduct them. Tolkien says that originally there was a connection between the Barrow Whites and the ringwraiths. They're kind of reminiscent of each other. And they're kind of almost a mixture of the Draugr and vampires because they have an aversion to sun. And that's kind of a recurrent theme, as we shall see, of kind of evil entities. And the sun goes back to the two trees of Valinor, which are some of the most important things in Middle-earth. We'll cover that later once we get to our discussion of the giant spiders. So that's it for the Barrow Whites. Next, we're going to talk about the Orcs. We all know the Orcs. They're very, very prominent. Is that even a word, prominent? I feel like when I say that, prevalent, prominent, whatever. They're very prevalent in the movies, the Peter Jackson movies, as well as the movies from the 70s, the animated ones. They look different. Basically, they were created by Morgoth, who is the other name for Melkor. Melkor was originally his name, and then Morgoth is what he became when he decided to turn evil. So basically how they were created was Melkor kidnapped some elves and tortured them. And he tortured them so bad that they became the first of the orcs. And that's kind of another recurrent theme that we're going to see is some of the evil creatures being almost a simulacra of one of the better creatures, I guess you could say, on Middle-earth. They lived in subterranean layers with fallen Maiar and other servants of Melkor. And what Maiar are, say that 5 times fast. Well, actually, that might be hard, but what the Maiar are primordial spirits that were created to help the Valar shape the world. And 5 of the Maiar actually became wizards. So, Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the Blue Wizards are the 5 Maiar. And so Gandalf himself is a very ancient and very powerful being in the whole history and realm of Arda. The orcs came under control of Saruman, as we can see during the Lord of the Rings movies. Saruman is ordering them around from Orthanc in Isengard. Some notable things in the history of the orcs: they were strengthened when Sauron returned to Dol Guldur. And if you are not familiar, Dol Guldur is the ancient castle that Sauron inhabited as the necromancer that is in The Hobbit. There came a new race of orcs called the Black Uruks. Saruman created the race of Uruk-hai, which are the bigger, stronger, more dominant orcs. Following the abandonment of Khazad-dûm, the orcs colonized the hills and killed King Thror. And Thror was the dwarven king who was the father of Thorin Oakenshield, I believe. And Khazad-dûm is inside of the Mines of Moria. That is where Gandalf fights with the Balrog. And even as I'm talking, you can see just how deep the history Tolkien created is. It's really, really amazing. Some of the origins of orcs. In Old English, orc means demon. And in Tolkien's language, it's essentially meant to mean bogeyman. And mythologically, the term Orkneys is used in Beowulf, and Beowulf is one of the main sources for Lord of the Rings, especially The Hobbit, I would say, with Smaug and the dragon and everything, the going to slay the monster or satiate the monster, I guess. Tolkien was one of the biggest scholars of Beowulf, actually. And so Orkneys is a term for monsters there. Like I said, in the Old English, orc means demon or even ogre. They seem to be related. And there was a god of the underworld called Orcus. One of the main orcs in the Fellowship of the Ring, or I guess it's the Two Towers. It's in the Two Towers, is Grishnak. You might remember him from Lord of the Rings. He's kind of he's the orc that takes Merry and Pippin aside to kill them. And it goes a little bit differently in the book as opposed to the movie. They're not fighting over if they're going to eat the hobbits when Merry and Pippin escape. Instead, Merry and Pippin realize that Grishnak knows about the ring and that he thinks they have it. But what's interesting is that often one of the criticisms of Lord of the Rings has been that it's racist because the orcs are read as black people, especially in the Peter Jackson films. But out of the descriptions I've read, they never are explicitly described as being black. I could be missing a description there. If you look at the 70s movies, they have blue skin. So I would actually argue that they might be caricatures of German infantrymen, because as we know, Tolkien was, he fought in World War I, and obviously World War II had happened by the time he wrote Lord of the Rings, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure they were written in the 50s, and Grishnak to me sounds like a German word. So that's kind of how I was reading them, actually. I think that there could be sort of an interesting inquiry to be done there. And that's one of those words I can't say is inquiry. I can't say it how most people do. So, but that's it for the orcs. Moving on to the ents. You'll remember ents as being the talking trees. They are basically spirits of the forest. They specifically inhabit Fangorn Forest. And, of course, they are famous in the trilogy for basically harboring Merry and Pippin, kind of saving them, and Merry and Pippin getting them to take action against Saruman. And they end up flooding Isengard and trapping Saruman in Orthanc. So they play a huge role in that regard. And of course, that takes place during the Battle of Helm's Deep. Those two things are happening at the same time. Gandalf is riding on Shadowfax, going from one place to the next, ensuring that both of those victories are to be had. Treebeard is probably the most famous of the ents, and he is actually Fangorn. So there's, I believe in the Elvish tongue, Treebeard is his name, but Fangorn is his name in the Entish language, if I'm not mistaken. I love the names for the ents. Quickbeam is another one of the more famous ents who decides not to take part in the entire Entmoot, which is what they're basically meeting to discuss if they should take action against Saruman was called. Quickbeam was young and not as deliberate and slow as the other ents. Their Entmoot took like 3 days, I think, to go, and I really like the descriptions of how they speak and how they communicate. It's described as kind of a hum or a sound, kind of like a song that fills the valley. It's said that the elves actually taught the ents how to speak, and the ents originally were created through the music of the Ainur at the behest of Yavanna, who was the queen of the Valar. She really wanted something to be able to speak for the land, and that ended up being the ents. Morgoth / Melkor created trolls as imitations to ents. So similarly how orcs are made in the image of the elves, basically, so are trolls made in the image of the ents, but just kind of a more evil version. And it's kind of how, just as Tolkien is creating new creatures from the old, so is Morgoth, but just in a more nefarious way, you could say. There used to be entwives, is what they're called, wives of the ents, but they left and they couldn't find them, so there can't be any new ents until the ents and the entwives are, found, or once they find each other. After the War of the Ring, they are gifted Non Curunir, which is the realm that Orthanc and Isengard are located inside of. Actually, in the original Anglo-Saxon, ent means giant. So ents are actually a new kind of species and character in the folkloric tradition of giants. So they're in that way, in that sense of the word, they're one of the staples of fantasy and folklore, alongside wizards and princesses and trolls and stuff like that. But Tolkien made a new, fresh way for them to exist, which is something that I really like. Okay, our final discussion is going to be about Shelob and giant spiders. So, Shelob, of course, is a giant spider that lives in Mordor. Gollum tricks Frodo and Sam into going into its lair. And Shelob is actually an offspring of a being called Ungoliant, which is one of the major antagonists of the first two ages, the Silmarillion ages. Basically, Ungoliant was a force of darkness that was not even known to the Valar. And once Melkor is defeated, Ungoliant flees and takes the form of a spider. And it was kind of similar to the spider in It. If you know kind of the deep lore of It, which is another fandom that I belong to, when Pennywise takes the form of the clown, that's just kind of one of his new iterations. And Pennywise is actually one of the most ancient dark sources in the universe that comes to Earth during the time of the dinosaurs and lives on in multiple different iterations, but its ultimate form, at least to humans, is that of a spider. So that's kind of how Ungoliant is as well. I don't know if Stephen King used that lore to create it, but it's possible, but it's an interesting coincidence. What happens is Melkor seeks Ungoliant out and gets her to attack the trees of Valinor and to poison them and drink their sap. So the trees of Valinor are two of the most important basically things in Middle Earth before the time that we're used to, starting with The Hobbit. Again, this is the time of like the Silmarils. This is the first age. And basically they're sources of light, primordial sources of light. And when they're destroyed, they actually create the sun and moon. So that's what I was kind of referring to earlier, is that the